This is Face to Face. This story comes from a man named Cave, and it involves him, his friend, and his father, all seeing something together in the woods in Washington State. So this isn't something I tell people that aren't super close to me, and not because I'm embarrassed or anything. It's more like it's just so straightforward and descriptive of a sighting that it sounds totally made up. But I saw something unexplainable with my own eyes, and I was with two other people who can vouch for me. So it wasn't something you could explain away with, oh, it was just an animal, or you were imagining things, or something like that. I don't know. This wasn't that. This happened back in the summer of 2005. I was 13 but still stuck in a boyish state, as I guess I was a late bloomer. My dad had just come back from Iraq, and things were weird. He'd been gone for a year, and while I'd been counting down the days until he came home, when he finally did, it wasn't like I expected. He wasn't the same guy who left. Before, he'd been this laid-back, joke-cracking, easygoing dad. But when he came back, it was like he had this weight on him he couldn't shake. He didn't talk about it much, about the war, I mean. But you could tell he'd seen things he wasn't ready to share. Fishing was our way of reconnecting, I think. My dad loved it, and even though I wasn't particularly good at it, I loved spending that time with him. It was peaceful, simple, just me and him out on the lake. This trip, though, was different. For some reason, my dad invited my best friend Chris to come along. Now, Chris was the kind of guy who could make anything fun. He was always joking around, always doing dumb stuff to make you laugh. He acted like he wasn't scared of anything, but looking back, I think that was just his way of handling situations he didn't fully understand. We loaded up my dad's old Ford, a rusty, rattling beast of a truck that sounded like it was about to fall apart every time you hit a bump, and headed out to Lake Cushman. The drive itself was an adventure. The radio didn't work unless you smacked it just right, the AC was non-existent, and the windows barely rolled down, so by the time we got there, we were sweating like crazy. But it didn't matter. The second we pulled up to the lake, the smell of pine and moss hit me, and it was like the forest was welcoming us in. If you've never been to Lake Cushman, it's out in the Olympic National Forest, surrounded by massive trees that look like they've been standing there for centuries. The ground is covered in thick moss, and the air is so fresh it almost stings your lungs. The lake itself is like glass, so still and clear you can see the bottom in the shallow parts. It's beautiful, but it's also heavy. Like the forest has its own presence, you know? It makes you feel small, insignificant, like you're a guest in someone else's world. The first few hours were great. We set up at our usual spot, a little clearing near the shore, and started fishing. My dad grilled hot dogs on his portable grill while Chris and I skipped rocks and argued about who could throw farther. For a little while, everything felt normal. My dad even cracked a few smiles, which was a big deal back then. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt right. But then, late in the afternoon, things started to feel off. At first, it was just little things. The birds that had been chirping all day went quiet. The breeze stopped. And the air, it felt heavy, like the kind of heavy you get before a thunderstorm. My dad was the first to notice. He elbowed me and said, "Hey, you hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked. "Exactly," he said. It was so quiet it was almost loud, if that makes sense, like the absence of sound was its own noise. I do remember hearing the whining buzz of the many flies that hadn't left our picnic table alone all day. My dad stopped what he was doing and stared toward the tree line. His face was serious, his jaw tight. That's when the smell hit us. I don't even know how to describe it. It was awful. Like wet dog, rotting meat, and garbage all mixed together. It was so strong it made my stomach churn. Chris gagged, pulling his shirt up over his nose, and my dad muttered something about a dead animal. But the look on his face said he didn't really believe that. Then we heard it. The first crack, loud and sharp like a gunshot, froze all three of us in place. My dad had been crouching by the grill, fiddling with the propane tank, but now he stood up so fast, the lawn chair he'd been leaning on toppled over. Chris and I were sitting by the cooler, and I could see the exact moment his face shifted from confusion to fear. It was the kind of sound you didn't just hear. You felt it in your chest, like a ripple passing through the ground itself. "Probably just a branch," I mumbled, more to myself than anyone else, trying to keep my voice steady. But my dad didn't say anything, which was way worse than if he'd told me I was wrong. When my dad got quiet, it meant he was thinking, calculating. He stared out toward the tree line, squinting like he was trying to make out shapes in the shadows. Chris nudged me. "Dude, what if it's a bear?" The word hit me like a slap. A bear. Duh. That made sense. It's the woods. Bears are a thing. But something about that explanation didn't sit right. I'd seen bears before, on TV, in pictures, even once in real life when we visited Yellowstone. They're big and scary, sure, but they don't make this kind of noise. This crack was deliberate, like something wanted us to hear it. Then it happened again. Crack. This time closer. The sound echoed through the trees, and I swear it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My dad's head snapped toward the direction of the noise, and I watched his shoulders tense. He turned back to us, his voice low and sharp. "Pack up. Now." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. My dad was a lot of things. Calm, steady, unshakable. But right then, his tone carried an edge I'd never heard before. Not even the time I broke his favorite fishing pole trying to use it as a sword. Chris and I didn't argue. We scrambled to grab our stuff, stuffing gear into the tackle box without any rhyme or reason. As I shoved the fishing lines into the cooler, I caught a whiff of it again. That smell. It had been faint before, like it was riding the breeze, but now it was everywhere, thick and choking. It was like wet dog, but way worse. Wet dog that had been left in the sun to rot and then left in a hot, dank dumpster. My stomach churned and my hands started shaking so bad I fumbled the cooler lid. "Jesus," Chris muttered, gagging as he pulled his shirt up over his nose. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, not wanting to say it any louder. It felt wrong to speak, like the forest was listening. I glanced over at my dad, who was busy throwing the grill into the back of the truck like it was a piece of trash. His movements were fast but focused, his eyes darting from the tree line to us and back again. I realized then that he wasn't just rushing us, he was protecting us, and that scared me more than anything. As I bent down to grab the tackle box, another sound broke through the silence. It wasn't a crack this time, it was something else, low and guttural, like a growl that wasn't quite animal. It rose and fell in waves, vibrating through the air like it was alive. I froze, crouched halfway to the ground, my hand still on the box. Chris grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" he hissed. I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone dry, and my heart was hammering so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The growl turned into something higher pitched, like a warbling cry, and then it stopped just as suddenly as it started. The silence after was deafening. I swear I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. Then, the scream. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, or ever want to hear again. It wasn't just a scream. It was layers of sound, like multiple voices overlapping. One was deep and guttural, like a roar, but the other was high and piercing, almost human. The two sounds twisted together, rising in this awful, unholy crescendo that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Chris dropped the cooler he was holding, and I flinched as it hit the ground with a hollow thud. Neither of us moved to pick it up. My dad, though, he didn't freeze. He was already halfway to the truck, his jaw clenched and his eyes hard. My dad didn't hesitate. He told us to pack up. Fast. Chris and I scrambled to gather everything, throwing it into the truck bed as quickly as we could. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the tackle box twice. That's when we heard the scream. I don't even know how to describe it. It was this mix of a roar and a scream, like two voices layered on top of each other. One low and guttural, the other high-pitched and shrill. It echoed through the trees, and I swear I felt it in my chest. Chris froze, his eyes wide, and I just stood there, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my ribcage. My dad shouted for us to get in the truck. We didn't need to be told twice. Chris dove into the back seat, I climbed into the passenger seat, and my dad was already behind the wheel, starting the engine. He floored it. As the truck shot forward, I twisted around to look out the back window. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought I was seeing things. You know how, when the light's bad and your nerves are shot, your brain starts filling in the gaps with whatever makes the most sense? I wanted it to be a shadow, maybe a trick of the trees moving in the wind, except there wasn't any wind. Then it stepped out of the tree line, and I knew right away that what I was seeing wasn't a shadow or my imagination. It was real, and it was wrong. The first thing I noticed was the size. It was massive, 8 feet, maybe 9, and built like it didn't belong here. Not bulky, not like a bear. Bears are big, sure, but they're rounded. This thing wasn't. It was all straight lines and angles, like its bones didn't fit under its skin right. Its shoulders were so broad they looked like they could snap in half if it turned too fast. And its arms, I don't even know how to describe its arms. They were too long, longer than they should have been, like they were made for grabbing and pulling. The fur wasn't like an animal's fur either. It was patchy, mangy, and wet-looking, like it had been dragged through mud and left to rot. There were bits of leaves and moss tangled in it, and when it moved, the fur hung off its body in clumps. The light was starting to fade by then, but I could still see the shine of its skin under the patches where the fur was thin. It wasn't smooth like you'd expect. It was almost scaly. Not like a lizard, but rough, like bark or old scars. Its face was the part that stuck with me the most. It wasn't animal, but it wasn't human either. It had this wide, flat nose that looked like it had been smashed in, and the mouth was too big, stretching across its face in a way that felt purposeful, like it was designed to show as many teeth as possible. And those teeth, they weren't sharp, not like a predator's, but they were uneven, like they'd been ground down or broken over time. They didn't look like they were meant for eating. They looked like they were just there. The eyes, though, those were the worst. They were sunken deep into its skull, so dark I couldn't make out the pupils, and when they locked on me, it was like the air got sucked out of my lungs. It wasn't like when an animal looks at you, just reacting on instinct. This thing was looking at me, thinking about me. It felt personal, like it was deciding what to do next. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was like my body had locked up. My brain kept trying to make sense of it, comparing it to everything I knew. Bears, gorillas, even people, but nothing fit. It wasn't any of those things. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before, and that made it worse. There was no box to put it in, no way to make it less terrifying by naming it. It just was. The smell hit me again, stronger this time. It was so thick and foul I could taste it in the back of my throat. It wasn't just wet dog or rotting meat. It was something else. Something sour and chemical, like ammonia, but worse. It felt like it was clinging to my skin, sinking into my clothes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the smell wasn't just coming from it. It was part of it. "It's following us," I shouted, though my voice came out cracked and thin. Chris was curled up in the back seat, his hands over his ears like he thought that would make it all go away. My dad didn't say a word. He just kept his eyes on the road, his face set like stone. I don't think I'd ever seen him scared before, not like that. The thing moved like it didn't belong to the same world as us. It wasn't running, not really. It was more like it was gliding, its legs snapping forward in this awful, rhythmic way. The arms swung at its sides, but not like they were helping it run. They swung loose, like they didn't need to do anything. It felt deliberate, like it was in control of every single movement, and it knew exactly how much effort it had to use to keep up. I couldn't stop watching it, even though every part of me was screaming to look away. My brain was racing, trying to figure out how it was keeping pace with us. It shouldn't have been able to move that fast. Its legs were too long, its body too heavy. The ground should have slowed it down, but it didn't. It moved like it had done this 1,000 times before, like chasing things was just part of its day. The way it looked at me, God, it was like it knew me. Not just saw me, but knew me. Like it wasn't seeing me as a person, but as something it understood on a level I couldn't. It didn't feel like prey, though. It didn't feel like I was in danger of being eaten or attacked. It felt worse than that. It felt like I was part of some sick game, and it was enjoying watching me panic. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. It skidded to a halt, its legs stiffening like it had hit an invisible wall. For a second, it just stood there, its head tilted like it was listening for something. Then it turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. We just continued back home quietly. My dad mentioned he had a migraine, and for some reason we kind of collectively decided that was why we left. Dad got sick again and left his meds at home. That's what we told his girlfriend, at least. He never brought this back up again, so we didn't either. Also, I always was careful not to upset my dad because of all his post-traumatic stress from Iraq. I felt bad for him because this felt like more of that, whatever we saw. Chris and I just kind of stopped hanging out. We have talked about seeing Bigfoot a couple times, but I don't know. Maybe I'll reach out and see if he wants to chat about it again, but I'd honestly rather not.